We're here today with Ashley Appling from GrooveIsKing.com, and he also plays drums around North Point and has played on the past couple of North Point live albums. And Ashley's going to talk to us about tuning drums and picking out drum heads, and also help us out with our drum miking section. So Ashley, why don't you talk to us about drum heads and how to pick out the right drum head?
Well, thanks for having me, Dustin.
Yeah.
And I think what Dustin is doing is really helpful for audio engineers and drummers alike, because honestly, you know, I've always said to you guys, my students, and you know, Dustin knows this and can attest to it, that you can have a great drummer and kind of mediocre instrumentalist in that band, or great drum sounds, and it can make the band sound a lot better than they actually are. But if you have bad drum sounds and a bad drummer, it doesn't matter how good your singer or your guitar players are or anything, the band is not going to sound as good. So first of all, I mean, the contact point of the drum and who's playing is crucial, and that's why we're going to talk about a little bit about tuning and actual head selection. You know, a lot of churches and even a lot of drummers in general in studios will, there's a lot of question and debate as to when do you replace your head and what kind of heads do you use when you replace them. For me personally, for snare drums, the head of choice is a Remo coated ambassador. A lot of times I'll use a Remo CS, which is a controlled sound ambassador, which has just a little reinforcement ring right here in the middle to keep the dip from happening. That happens ever so often, especially since the snare head is the most struck drum in the set. But a Remo coated ambassador on the snare, because it's one ply coated, it gives a nice ambient tone to the drum. And you know, when you're tuning a snare, Dustin's going to attach a module that I did on just even snare drum tuning. But when you're tuning snare and toms, you don't want to tighten the head so much that you actually choke the sound out of the drum. And we'll go to the kit in just a minute and talk a little bit about how to do that. But it's good to listen to the head. I mean, you can't hear it right here necessarily, but when you pick a head up, when you hit it, it should have even a little tone in the head, because they can have heads that are dead even upon arrival before you even get on. I've put different heads on a drum and the drum will sound different just from the same type of head, but different heads of the same type. So make sure you get a good drum head. We're going to take a look, and there may even be a split screen of this possibly going on, but in the drum head itself, there comes a point when if you look at your drum kit, whether it's at a church or a club or gig, outside setting, whatever, when it's pitted, and really dark in the center, you probably have beat the elasticity and the tone out of that drum head. So that's a first measure. You know, when you see a lot of duct tape and people putting t-shirt strips underneath your drums, that's a no-no. You want the drum to have ambience and ring. Another head selection that I use for toms a lot, for a live setting, especially if you have multiple drummers playing and you want some longevity, are a clear head. It's a 2-ply Remo Emperor. It's a EMPEROR, Emperor Clear, and it's got a little bit of a oil residue between the heads. It gives it a little darker tone, but it still has a lot of attack. If you wanted to get a little warmer sound of a 2-ply tom, then you would go with an Emperor Coated. They make as well. But this is a great one for toms. I don't know if you can hear just in me talking the tone of that head. You can hear it really well. So make sure that that tone is there. And then, you know, again, don't over-tune and don't tape down and muffle too much. I'll show you a little thing I have called moon gels in just a minute as well that goes on the toms to help with just finding a bad spot, whether it might be a lug that's out of harmonic a little bit with other lugs. But these two head selections, Coated Ambassador for snare and a Clear Emperor for toms, are two of the ones that I recommend and that I use in recordings all the time. I'll even use Coated Ambassadors if you're going to do a recording, just because they're a little thinner. They give it a little more tone in the drum for a recording process, but longevity, go with the Clear Emperor's 2-ply head on your toms. One last thing before we even go and talk about tuning is head selection is really important. We talked a little bit about the Clear Emperor 2-ply and Coated Ambassadors. You know, there's a place and time for pinstripes and the really thick drum heads and the muted tones. You know, when I'm in the studio, there are times when I'll throw a pinstripe on and, put a little duct tape in some certain spots, but I'm talking quarter-size pieces, and I've even thrown towels on toms. But in a live setting where you're trying to cover a 95% majority of music, pop, rock, whatever it might be, a little country thing or an R&B thing, you need to have a sound that is a little more generic, and usually that's going to be a coated ambassador or a clear emperor with as little muffling as possible, especially if you have a good drum set to begin with. If you begin to dampen and put strips of t-shirts under toms to try to dampen them and muffle them down, and you think that's actually what's helping your front of house sound, you're actually going to be kind of getting diminishing returns by doing that, because you are going to be trying to EQ in tones that are not even present in the drum to begin with, and that's going to make your job harder. So try to get the best sound from the drum by choosing the right heads and working with your drummer, and drummers, you guys working with your audio guy to come up with the best sound that's going to benefit the room or the environment that you're in. So let's go talk about tuning drums. So when it comes to tuning drums, you've got your kick drum, tom, snare. There are many variables, and we're going to talk a little bit in generalities, basically, or just what I would say 95% of the music that drummers are playing today, modern pop music, rock, country, R&B. There's a general guideline that I like to follow, and we can go into a lot more detail. If you've got more questions, you can email in to Dustin or even email myself at ashley@groovesking.com. But a general starting point after you've got your head selection, we're using coated ambassadors today, but I like to put the head on, and then I like to get a finger tension. My muscle is a good guideline to go by, just because I know I can only go so hard. So what I'll do is I'll take and put pressure on the lug and the rim and use the same hand all around. If I have to spin the drum, and I'll either finger tighten the lug, I can do it this way, and finger tighten here. Yamahas have a little more tensioning, or I'll put a drum key on and I'll just lightly move until I can't move it anymore. And that gets a good starting point. And you do this all the way around until you've got it. And then you'll take the drum key in your hand. For an audio engineer, for a drummer, this is crucial. This is where you don't want to over tighten too quick. When I say small turns, I'm talking like a 16th to an 1/8 of a turn. If a full revolution was a full revolution, then a small amount. So like just an 1/8 of a turn. And you're going to go, starting here, if you have to hold your finger in a clockwise pattern, then move clockwise to the next lug, back across the drum, then clockwise to the next lug, 1/8 of a turn, clockwise to the next lug, and then you're back at a starting point. Now, you'll do this one more time with that same amount of turn. So, small little turn, and again, these are minute turns. 16th to an 1/8. All right, then here is where I like to call what I call seating the head. In a new head, especially the clear emperors, you're going to hear a little bit of a cracking process, but this is where you just take your palm and just kind of press down in the middle, and then just barely in the center around the edges, and you're going to kind of seat it. And then we're going to go around with one more turn, starting in the same lug. Small little turn. And for most drums, especially floor toms and 12 to 13 inch mounted or rack toms, this is going to be pretty close without any muffling to where you want to be. That's a generally good starting point. Now, what I like to do with like a snare drum is I'll turn the snares off to tap around, but with a floor tom is about 1 inch away from each lug. Just tap. And fortunately, we are pretty close on this. You can hear there's pretty general tone selection. Now, with this in mind, since we're so close, there's a little bit of a dive. Don't ever neglect your resonant head. The bottom head of a drum is the resonant. The top is the batter. The resonant head on this one has already been tuned appropriately, and usually I like to tune the resonant head just a little bit lower in tone than the batter head. So there's a little bit of a dive to the drum. You don't want a ton. You don't want it to but you want to just a little bit of a dive, because it gives a nice natural feel to the tone, and the drum won't sound choked. So With this, I'm just a little bit too much, so I'm gonna tighten up just a little bit. I might skip a lug here just to give a little bit of a feel. So now that was a little bit too much, so I'm gonna back off where I was at. So since that was too much, and you see, I mean, it's hairpin turns. I'm going to use what we call moon gel instead of duct tape, and duct tape is always a last resource that you can use. But these little moon gel pads, if you can see here in my hand, they're made by Tom, and they're really, pretty inexpensive to get a few things of this. It's always good to have around, but little bitty pieces. And sometimes if you've got a spot on the drum where the overtone is ringing weird, which I kind of noticed a little bit right in here. So I might put a piece right in that particular spot. And then I end up getting a pretty decent sounding drum. I might just tweak a little bit. Again, these are just small where I hear it, and it's just listening. If you start getting a lot of a wow, like a wow wow sound, then you're too tight on the batter head, and you'll just want to back off. So that's a general starting point where you want to be on a floor tom. Kick drum, there are a lot of variables. Head selection, type of muffling. General rule for kick drum is put the head on, do the same thing, you want to seat it, and you want to get just enough tension on the head so that there's no rattling in the lugs on there. And it's going to be more of you're looking for more of a smack kind of sound. And tighten the resonant head of the kick drum just a little tighter than your front one here. So it's the opposite rule for kick drum. The resonant head is a little tighter to give a little more tone, and the batter head here on the front is going to be a little looser with a little more flap to give you a little more smack. And basically what you're going to hear is, and if you want more tone out of the drum, depending on your drummer, if he's skilled in this area, he can leave the beater in to actually deaden it, or he can leave the beater out to allow more tone, especially for softer things like jazz. It'll pick up more tone. And what we're going to do now is there's a module that I did really detailed talking about snare drum tuning, and I want you to check that out. And that, because snare drum is 80% of your music. The toms, or what I call ear candy, they're placed in certain spots for accentuating moments of a tune. But the snare drum, you're hearing it every 2 and 4. It's the backbeat of the music, and that's a crucial part of what you're going to get in the front of house is the kick and the snare. So check this module out on the training and the tuning of a snare drum, and I think you'll find it really interesting.